Gentlemen, we will now go into the first topical part of our seminar. The general topic of cross-border education, as you may have seen from the reader, is quite a broad topic, and we will approach this topic today from a couple of different perspectives in 3 keynotes during this afternoon, and then tomorrow we will really work on the various aspects of the topic in our working groups. So I may ask Vicenzo Raimo to the rostrum. He is the director of the International Office of the University of Nottingham, and he will approach the topic from the point of view of, well, the internationalization debate or the internationalization hype, if I may call it. And he will ask the question whether transactional education developments really take us beyond the rhetoric of internationalization. Vicenzo, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Dear organisers, thank you both for inviting me to this beautiful city of Madrid and to give the presentation today at this Bologna Higher Education Expert Seminar. And thank you, UAM, for hosting this event. Before I get going, I wonder if I could just tell you a very short story about something that happened at a small college, a provincial college in Nottingham in 1932. We were a small provincial college. Most of the students at Nottingham College received degrees of the University of London. Most of the students were local students. The university was founded to meet the needs of the local population. But back in 1932, we were incredibly excited at this college to have a very distinguished visitor come, a visitor from overseas. That visitor took the train from London, and the guard on the train was very excited to see Professor Albert Einstein on his train. He said, "Professor, you're very welcome on our train today. Please let me know if there is anything I can do for you." He was a very excited guard. The train worked its way north from London, and partway through the journey, the conductor could see that Einstein was incredibly agitated. He was going through his pockets, looking through his briefcase. So the conductor went to see him and said, "Professor, is there anything I can do to help you?" He said, I'm afraid not. It's a complete disaster." And the conductor said, "Why?" He said, "I've lost my ticket." The conductor said, "It's not a problem, Professor Einstein. It's just a pleasure to have you on our train. You don't need a ticket today." And Einstein replied, "It's a big problem because I don't know where I'm going." 80 years later, this small provincial college now awards its own degrees. 1/3 of the students come from outside of the UK, and as you'll hear in a moment, this small provincial college turned into a university with campuses beyond the UK borders. Now, I was very lazy. I only read the title for this presentation on Thursday morning on the website, and I got a real shock. Do transactional developments take us beyond the rhetoric of internationalisation? For those of you that know anything about higher education developments in the UK, there's a lot of talk about the commoditisation of higher education and the increasing emphasis on what some would think of as short-term transactional relationships. Students buying teaching, governments and commercial organisations buying research and consultancy, even philanthropists buying access to appreciation or perhaps even to lost memories. And it's been argued by some, for example, Stefan Collini in his recent book published last year, What Are Universities For?, that with the commoditisation of universities, at least within the UK, we have, in some sense, lost some of the highest aspirations and ideals of the university as a public good, providing a range of benefits to individuals and to society, not all of which can be easily measured by economists' metrics. This really would be an interesting debate in the context of the development of today's university internationalisation strategies. But while you may want to ask me questions about internationalisation, perhaps encouraging the commoditisation of universities, at the end of this presentation or in discussions over the coming days. I'm afraid this isn't what I'm going to talk about. The reason for this interesting and perhaps controversial title is entirely due, I think, to an automatic spell checker. The actual topic of my presentation is, do transnational TNE developments take us beyond the rhetoric of internationalisation? So, having reminded myself of the title last week, I then wondered why you'd invited me to give this presentation. Is it because my university is considered a pioneer in both transnational education and internationalisation strategies more generally? The Times newspaper very kindly described Nottingham University as the closest the UK has to a truly global university. But I don't know whether anyone really believes that, even within my own university. But it's nevertheless a very nice quote for us to use in our marketing materials. Or perhaps I was invited because the University of Nottingham won the Guardian newspaper University Internationalisation Strategy of the Year very recently. You know, I think there's a real danger in getting carried away by awards and some of the hype around transnational education, which these newspapers have encouraged in the UK and maybe in other countries, I'm not sure. I know that some people think that TNE is a new thing and are running around with an almost gold rush mentality, and that some universities, encouraged by the UK government, see offshore developments and overseas campuses as the answer to current and future funding concerns. Last autumn, Vince Cable, our Minister for Business, Universities and Innovation, announced that the government would be producing various industrial strategies: an industrial strategy for the telecommunications sector, an industrial strategy for automotive engineering, etc., etc. And yes, you've guessed it, we're also having an industrial strategy for education in the UK. To support the education industrial strategy, the government has announced the establishment of a specialist education unit within UK Trade and Investment to exploit opportunities for the development of transnational education activities by UK universities. The press release about the new unit says that it will support individual institutions, businesses or consortia of UK education providers and suppliers to respond to large-scale commercial deals. It will seek to unite a diverse sector and strengthen its opportunities for commercial success in large-scale competitive opportunities. And the rationale described for the unit is that our education sector has the potential to make a significant contribution to growth. Education exports are currently worth £14 billion a year in the UK and could be worth around £21.5 billion in 2020 and nearly £27 billion in 2025. And this new government unit is in addition to the British Council's own relatively new Transnational Education Service, which I quote, aims to help institutions develop and effectively market international programmes. Its dedicated TNE managers in country provide bespoke support to identify the best opportunities for your courses, broker relevant partnerships, develop and execute marketing plans, and establish a clear route map through the local legal and regulatory processes, including quality assurance agencies. Of course, I welcome the support British universities get from the British Council, and I welcome the government's move to provide more support to universities in their international activities. But it does feel a bit like our government has only just discovered this thing we've come to call transnational education. And it saddens me that in the statements about TNE, we rarely mention students. You know that it really wasn't very long ago that the British Council and even the British University International Liaison Association, WELA, the body which represents staff who work in international offices, saw the development of TNE, particularly British university campuses overseas, such as those which my own university has, as a threat to traditional student recruitment. You know, they wouldn't even allow Nottingham University to promote its overseas campuses at British Council exhibitions and education promotion events overseas. In some ways, it feels as if we've come a really long way in the UK in just a few years. The government and the British Council now wholeheartedly support transnational education, or at least for the government if there's an economic imperative. We've seen in a very short period of time a huge increase in the number of international students studying for a UK degree overseas, but don't believe the official hype that you're given by ministers when they say that there are now more international students studying for a UK degree programme overseas than there are international students studying for a UK degree in the UK. And I'll show you the actual data in a moment. TNE activities are now recognised as helping the UK maintain its international education market position in what has become, I'm sure you'll know, an incredibly competitive environment. And of course, TNE is seen as an answer to the increasing restrictions being placed on UK universities as a result of visa and immigration policy changes. But I also think that increasingly TNE is being recognised as providing a wider set of benefits to our students, to our researchers and to our communities. So, as I said, ministers and now others often incorrectly say that there are more international students studying for a UK degree overseas than there are international students in the UK. So just let's take a quick look at the official data. First, this is the data for students from overseas studying for a degree programme in the UK. So there are 488,000 international students in a British university. These are students from outside of Europe, of which 433,000 were studying for a degree level qualification, a bachelor's, a master's or a PhD programme. And then here's the data that the government often quotes. 503,000 students studying for a UK degree overseas through a TNE arrangement. The word that they forget is they use the term degree when really what they should be saying is award, because one university, Oxford Brookes University, makes up almost 50% of that figure for students who are not taking any degree, they're taking an accountancy qualification and have no intention of studying for a degree. So we're not exactly comparing like with like. So once we strip out the Oxford data, we see that there's still a very large number of international students studying for a degree, a UK degree overseas, more than 260,000, so just half the number studying in the UK. Of course, it's still a very big number, which has seen remarkable growth of almost 35% over the past 5 years. But as well as the positives I mentioned before the slight data detour, as I've said, it does feel as if in the UK we think we've only just invented TNE. The reality, as I'm sure you know, is that we've had transnational education activities for a very long time. We just didn't call them TNE. Whatever form of TNE you're considering developing, someone has probably already tried it or is already doing it now. And many of today's new markets for TNE have probably had some form of TNE activity in them in the past. In our excitement about today's new TNE activities, we've forgotten that the University of London has been running programmes around the world since 1858 and has a whole stream of famous alumni, including Nelson Mandela. Sorry, I have a technical problem. Can anybody help me? I just want to move slide. Okay, so technical problem solved. So, and guess what? Students and scholars and their teaching and research travelled beyond national borders even before the University of London was born. Higher education has always been international. The great scholars of ancient history and our ancient universities were international by nature. To quote Marginson and van der Vende, higher education has always been more internationally open than most sectors because of its immersion in knowledge, which never showed much respect for juridical boundaries. The internationalisation, or globalisation if you prefer, of higher education is neither new nor a British invention. So with 15 slides down, that was, I'm afraid, just my introduction. So what do I plan to cover? I hope in a more structured way in what remains of this slot. I want to say something about the drivers and rationale for TNE. I hope to describe some of its forms and benefits. I want to say something about selecting markets, choosing partners and risks in TNE, and finally end with something about my own university. So, drivers for TNE, at least at a national and international level. Macro drivers, I'm sure you all appreciate: rapidly declining costs of mobility, the spread of new technology, and dramatic falls in information and communication costs. And of course, there are also a series of non-economic policy drivers, including promotion of cultural exchange, policy intervention, as we know in this room, to promote mobility and collaboration, Erasmus and now Horizon 2020, government's own international development assistance programme, and use of education as a foreign policy instrument. The focus of much of the UK's recent TNE activity has been commercial, market expansion for international student recruitment and tuition fee income. But honestly, what I say to my colleagues in the UK, unless your strategy is short-term, pilot high and sell it cheap, it's not a sustainable strategy, as we've seen from the numerous examples of retrenchment from TNE, in particular by Australian universities. TNE activity can be and should be about much more than just international student recruitment. TNE can be developed as a means of enriching the student experience, gaining leverage from collaborative research, facilitating network creation, benchmarking, brand development, and social learning and relationship building. And TNE can take many forms, from low-cost entry models such as faculty mobility and experience to greenfield campus developments at the other end of the spectrum. I tried to develop a matrix showing which different forms of TNE activity met different rationale. So, for example, the primary driver of validation and franchise activity in the UK predominantly being about money, or twinning programmes about the development of secure student recruitment pipelines. Again, money. Or maybe campuses, at least the island campus as developed by a number of US universities, as a means of providing opportunities for home students. The reality, I think, is that you could probably develop all of those different forms of TNE activity for a variety of purposes. So, for example, in the UK, we've typically viewed twinning programmes as an international student recruitment pipeline. My university, Nottingham, has a twinning programme with Thammasat University in Thailand, which brings in more than 50 undergraduate engineering students to our UK campuses annually. It's a good, solid recruitment pipeline, and one of the reasons Nottingham is the top recruiter of students from Thailand in the UK by a long, long way. But twinning programmes don't just have to be one way and can be combined with joint or double degree activity. In the 1990s, when I worked at Sussex University, we had a twinning programme in economics with Grenoble, which saw students move in both directions, articulating with full credit transfer, so irrespective of the home or the original university, the students graduated with both a BA degree in economics from Sussex University and a maîtrise from Grenoble. The primary driver of an executive MBA delivered in country on a fly-in model in Singapore might be about money, but exactly the same programme delivered in Ghana might be about supporting capacity development in that country. So, having thought about the rationale and the different forms of TNE, which markets should you look at for TNE development? Let me start with a traditional model for market development from the corporate sector. You can choose to penetrate the markets in which you're already active by the development of additional activities, i.e. expanding your programme portfolio. There are obviously lots of advantages to this approach, not least of which is that your marketing channels and contacts should already be well developed and established, thereby reducing the costs of launching new programmes. Or perhaps once you've got a successful model working in one country, you can try repeating that model elsewhere. So at Nottingham, we launched a blended learning postgraduate certificates in education in Nigeria about 5 years ago. Nigeria is probably the hardest place in the world to launch such a programme. And we learnt an immense amount from the experience. We refined the model, we developed it, and we now run that same qualification in Thailand, the UAE, even here in Spain, and a whole series of other countries around the world. In fact, it's our fastest growing TNE programme. Or maybe a very different approach, perhaps the bravest approach, developing new activities in brand new markets. No doubt some universities with well-developed and broad TNE strategies will be active across all of those different areas. So having looked at the theory, which countries should we actually look to for TNE developments? Well, one solution might be to go for those countries in which there's already very well-established TNE. For the UK, that's Singapore, Malaysia, Hong Kong, Pakistan, Ghana, etc. All of these countries already have large numbers of students taking UK qualifications in country. Someone's already done the groundwork, has worked out the legal and quality assurance frameworks. So actually, relatively easy places to go in on the back of somebody else's activity. Or maybe a different approach would be to put your efforts into the high potential growth markets, such as the BRICS, or now the so-called Next 11, Bangladesh, Egypt, Indonesia, Iran, Mexico, Nigeria, Pakistan, Philippines, Turkey, South Korea, and Vietnam. The Next 11, or N11, are countries identified by Goldman Sachs as having a high potential of becoming, along with the BRICS, the world's largest economies in this century. The criteria that Goldman Sachs used were macroeconomic stability, political maturity, openness of trade and investment policies, and very important, the quality of education. Or maybe for some of you, the primary driver is about research, in which case maybe something like the British Royal Society's G20 and emerging research economies measured by research publications could be your starting point. Much, of course, will depend on how quickly you need the development to take place, how long before it becomes viable, whether you're competing with or working in collaboration with local domestic education provision. And of course, the legal and financial environment in which you'll be working. Questions that you'll need to consider are there educational hubs like the Knowledge Village in Dubai providing an easier entry route? What support and or hurdles are there from the local authorities? How easy is it to get work permits for your own staff from your home country? And how easy is it to transfer money in and out? Wherever you choose to work and whatever type of TNE activity you choose to develop, you're probably going to need partners. This has been one of the most difficult areas of debate we've had at the University of Nottingham since I've been there. And it continues to be an area which we really struggle to get agreement on. Some have argued that we should only play with universities like ourselves. Doing otherwise would damage our brand. While others have argued that we need to focus on partners who need us and can deliver today. Or perhaps we should work with partners who we can support and with which we can help to develop capacity in line with our broader internationalisation strategy. And of course, most of those universities wouldn't appear in any world university ranking. And then, of course, we're faced with the challenge of trying to balance longer-term potential, say in a new developing market, against a quick return in established markets or with established programmes, and balancing the effort needed to identify strategic partners versus responding to opportunities as they arise are all really tough questions. One thing that I do know is that a man or a woman is known by the company he or she keeps. So selecting partners, thinking about it very carefully in accordance with a strategy is incredibly important. And whoever you choose to work with in TNE developments, it's vital that you undertake thorough due diligence. We're often very quick to start the courtship process by the signing of MOUs. Rectors enjoy signing MOUs, I'm afraid to say. But MOUs can soon develop into detailed memorandum of agreement, and before you know it, You're married with commitments that you might find difficult to get out of. It's worth investing time and effort in the early stages of the relationship, because once you're married, divorce can be a very costly process. Have you asked the right questions of and about your partner? And are they asking you the same questions? Do they have the authority to enter into proposed agreements? Do they have the physical and human resources to deliver? Are they financially sound? Do they have the resources to deliver on commitments? And incredibly important, do they share your vision? And have you checked and tested the promises your potential partner has given? Is there a market? Do you and your partners have permissions from the appropriate educational authorities? Will the qualifications that are perhaps delivered locally be recognised? Can you get a financial return if that's a driver from your activity? And what happens if something goes wrong? Do you have the appropriate mediation remedies? And if all else fails, whose legal system are you using? And if it's not your own, do you have access to appropriate advice? And does a partnership add to or compete with your existing activities? How do you manage quality perceptions? And do you have the staff to manage the activities that you're proposing overseas? At Nottingham, we've developed our own rough T&E risk scales. I'm not suggesting that these risk scales are appropriate for all universities, but I think it's important that each of you, as you're entering these kinds of activities, develop some form of risk criteria. So we have one that's based around quality and another around finances. In terms of our own quality risk scale, we see overseas campuses as low risk. Our staff teach our degree programmes, so the risk to quality is low, whereas we see franchise and validation activities as incredibly high risk. Our financial risk scale is almost the exact opposite, but clearly different universities will draw the risk scale differently, depending on your own local factors and scale of activities. But whatever you choose to do, and whatever level of risk you think is acceptable, it's really vital to have an exit strategy in place in case things go wrong, or as in the case of the University of South Australia, and if you know the University of South Australia, it had huge T&E activity in East and Southeast Asia. A new Vice-Chancellor, a new Rector came into place and decided that they needed a different strategy. And the time and effort, the amount of people involved in pulling out of T&E is huge. Put the time and effort in at the start and get it right. The route we've chosen at Nottingham for our T&E strategy is to develop what we've called a portfolio of activity, which recognises the need for a diversity of activity and a diversity of markets, and one which we believe, which we hope, takes a long-term view. It recognises that different forms of delivery can be equally valid and equally good, that encourages, incredibly important, that encourages internationalisation at home and the development of T&E as a means of providing new opportunities for home students, and one that actively promotes mobility for staff and students. I'm not for 1 minute suggesting that our strategy is perfect or necessarily the ideal model, but at the moment it's a strategy that's working for us. But you know, no matter how good a strategy is, how good it looks on paper, it needs to be underpinned by strong systems in finance, student records, human resources, and the international and other support offices. None of this is easy, and we certainly haven't got this all right at Nottingham, or we've certainly not got it all right yet. But the kinds of questions which need to be asked, and very, very important, answered by those set on T&E developments include, can things as basic as your student record system cope? I can tell you that ours can't at the University of Nottingham. Do you have finance and HR systems which can cope with offshore activities? We have 3 systems, not 1. And you'll need a staff development programme in place to ensure that your existing staff are trained and supported, and that new staff that you recruit have the appropriate skills to manage and get involved in TNE activities. The most well-known manifestation of Nottingham's TNE activities are the campuses in Malaysia, started in 1999, and in China 5 years later. Based on the risk charts we looked at earlier, ours is in some ways a very high-risk approach. Development on a greenfield campus requires a huge initial and continuing resource input, both direct and indirect resource input. Universities are incredibly good, or good, at measuring the direct resource input. I think they're generally very bad at recognising the indirect costs of these activities. But our approach is also very risk-averse when it comes to quality and reputation, which is why the campuses in Asia are fully integrated in an academic sense, campuses of the University of Nottingham. They're not twinning or franchise operations. The language of instruction is English. Senior staff are seconded from Nottingham, UK. Assessment procedures and degrees awarded are controlled from the headquarters in the UK. There's only one University of Nottingham qualification. It doesn't say UK, China, or Malaysia. And what we do in China and Malaysia are also subject to the UK's quality assurance agency's regime, as well as local quality assurance, the Ministry of Education in China and the Ministry of Education in Malaysia. In a sense, we have triple quality assurance. So, in conclusion, for a successful strategy, I would argue that you need clarity of vision. Understand why you want to develop TNE activity. And along with that, you need committed leadership, committed from the top. You need to properly resource TNE, put time and effort in early. That's much more cost effective than getting things wrong later. Be flexible in terms of the forms of delivery that you'll consider. And build clear positions around activities and markets by articulating what the things that you're doing means for the student and for the student experience and for your partners. And ensure that you give serious attention to those underpinning systems that we haven't yet got right at Nottingham, around your student systems, around your staff recruitment, around those core bureaucratic systems. And in answer to the question, do TNE developments take us beyond the rhetoric of internationalisation? I'm not sure that the answer is yes. I think at best the answer is maybe or sometimes, because it really depends on the kind of rationale that you have for TNE. In the ideal scenario, I would argue that TNE should be recognised as an important component of internationalisation, but it really is only one component and does not by itself make a fully internationalised institution. And same with international student recruitment. A high level of international student recruitment, as we have at Nottingham, does not make your university international. True university internationalisation strategies are broad-based and underpinned by a rationale around the development of the students' learning and the wider experience that students can gain. And it also supports research and knowledge transfer. Apologies to the British Council for my comments about them earlier, but I'm now happy to take questions, some of which maybe colleagues from the British Council might want to help me with. And I noticed from the programme that there's somebody here called Christine Mayer, who I know is a Nottingham University student, even though we've never met, but maybe she can correct the things that I've got wrong about my own institution in this presentation. Thank you.
Vicenzo, thank you very much for a most interesting and wonderfully structured presentation. Now he's ready to take questions. We have a quarter of an hour for questions and answers now, and later on, after the third speaker, we will have a kind of panel out here where you will also have the chance of asking questions. I think our students' helpers will run around with a microphone. They are the gentleman in the last row with the beige jacket. Who's running there? Somebody
right,
should
right
be.
at the
Yeah,
back.
that's, well, not exactly running, but
No,
we want to have you on the recording. Just again, please be so kind
Hello?
as to identify yourself.
Arta, thank you for giving me the opportunity to put a question to Vincenzo. Vincenzo, by the way, I'm Simon Sweeney from the UK, University of York, Bologna expert. Vincenzo, I was pleased that you delivered a series of caveats at the end of your presentation, all of which I entirely agreed with. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about the point that you included towards the end about the internationalisation experience for home students. Specifically, could you put some flesh on how home students in Nottingham benefit from the TNE focus of Nottingham on the transnational campus in Malaysia and China and elsewhere?
Sure.
So how does that actually feed into internationalising the home student experience?
Yeah.
Okay, Vincenzo, will you answer right away?
Okay, so I think that's an incredibly important point because we're very quick in the UK to say that our universities are international without really the substance behind that statement. And usually we say that our universities are international because we have large numbers of international students. So it's not unusual in a British university to have at least 15, 20, 25%, 30% at my university, more than 50% at LSE who come from outside of the UK. But as the questioner asks, what does that mean for the UK university student? We use something in the UK, a lot of our universities are now active in something called the International Student Barometer. And most recently, one of the questions that it asked students is, do you feel part of the university community? And it also had a specific question for UK students around what do international students mean for you? And I'm afraid that the findings weren't exactly happy reading for most of us in the UK. There was a disconnect often between the students from overseas and the students, the home students. And I think we're worrying a lot about this in the UK at the moment, and we're worrying about something that we call integration. I hate the term integration because integration to me means if you come to my university, you have to be like me. So what does integration mean for maybe the student, the female Muslim student from Malaysia who comes to the UK? Does that mean she has to be like the dominant group? And I think that's the wrong approach that we're thinking about. And I think what we need to do is encourage the development of different communities that interact around things that are important for them. In terms of TNE activity for the home students, we have at Nottingham an objective in our internationalisation strategy to get 1/4 of the undergraduate cohort to spend some part of their undergraduate degree programme overseas, 25%. I can tell you by UK standards that's huge. We're currently at about 22%, and we have the target to reach by 2014-15. One of our weaknesses in the UK is that we're pretty poor with languages. Our campuses in China and Malaysia provide a route in to two very different cultures to the UK. They provide a route into Malaysia and a route into China, but within a relatively familiar academic environment and context. So for the non-language, language speaker, they can go to China, study at a university that they recognise, and learn something about China at the same time. Of course, for the Chinese majors, we wouldn't encourage them to go to our own campus. We would encourage them to go to a Chinese university. So I think, to answer your question, the campuses are helping to increase mobility amongst our students. And again, mobility, just like TNE, is just one component of an internationalisation strategy.
Okay, thank you. Any other question? Then I move on to from me, left-hand side. Again, last row, the gentleman in the grey jacket.
Thank you. I'm Klaus-Peter Kratzer from Ulm University of Applied Sciences, Bologna expert in Germany. I don't want to spoil the fun, but I'm now the first non-UK speaker I submit. And on one hand, the solution you mentioned about increasing mobility, of course, is only, let's say, 50% of the ideal, because that controlled environment you send your students into is not exactly what you want to have as some sort of immersion into the culture. But that was not my original question. My original question was, do you also have in the course of your due diligence studies on the impact of your activities, and I'm not talking about joint and double degrees, I'm talking about franchising and branching, about the impact on the local market? Because it's my experience, we are cooperating with one German university abroad, that this German university, now in a different country, in this case it's Egypt, also has an impact on the local education market. And since those are acting at a profit, they typically carry some sort of, please forgive me, snob value among the local wealthy social layer. And this means that, let's say, the local universities are at a disadvantage there, because it's not as prestigious to have the local degree than as opposed to a British or German degree.
Okay, a most interesting question, Vicenzo, please.
Yeah, so just as the case that you talk about in Germany, in Egypt with the German university, both in Malaysia and China, we were invited to open campuses there in order to meet an element of the local government's own strategy. So in the case of Malaysia, Malaysia has an ambition to be a regional educational hub, to increase the strength of its own universities, and that they saw that by bringing a foreign university campus of a university that they know very well in Malaysia would add to the region's, to the country's strength as an educational hub, would raise the quality of local universities and would encourage more overseas universities to come in. And as we've seen in Malaysia over the last 10 years more than 10 years since we opened there, there's been a huge expansion in overseas universities and a huge expansion in the number of foreign students from outside of Malaysia coming to study in Malaysia, including, I should say, more than 100 students from the UK each year. The case in China, I think, is different, because China was looking to really expand its provision and recognise that it couldn't achieve that at the speed that it wanted to achieve simply by building its own universities, and saw the bringing in of a foreign university, and we were the first foreign university to open in China, or at least in the new China, in the People's Republic of China. They saw that as a way of building capacity. The truth is that they became very, very nervous as a result. And after the Nottingham and then the Liverpool development, the expansion of TNE activity in China has really slowed down. And I think partly because rather than campus approaches, there have been a lot of activity from British, from Australian, from other universities, a strategy that I call pilot high and sell it cheap approach, which is not about long-term sustainable relationships. We are seeing the impact of our campus in quite different ways. One of the key factors for success by the Chinese government in assessing its own universities is how many students gain employment or go on to postgraduate study. And we have an incredibly high success rate in China, much, much higher than we do in the UK. And that's partly because I think employers are recognising the kinds of different skills that students are gaining in our Western, quasi-Western environment than they do in a local university. That's not to suggest that one is better than the other. They're different, and different kinds of bodies will want different kinds of experiences. So we're adding to the mix.
Okay, I think I can take one more question. The lady in the center, will you just stand up then so that they can see you more easily? Okay, don't worry. Okay.
Same in Nottingham and in Malaysia.
Okay, so I'll repeat the question. The question about tuition fees,
Yes.
are they the same? And the answer is no, they're not. In fact, you know, I visited a university in America called Lehigh when I was doing a project for the UK government looking at the introduction of tuition fees in the UK, which, as you know, now are well established. And I met a professor of economics there who said there are almost as many different fees at Lehigh University as there are students. Now, it's not quite the same within the Nottingham family, but there are a lot of different fee structures depending on which campus you're studying, what kind of course you're studying and where you're from. But typically the costs in Malaysia are significantly cheaper than the costs in the UK. And what we've been able to do in Malaysia is widen our activity. So we now have students that would have in no way dreamed of coming to a UK university. They've now been able to go to our campus in Malaysia because the cost is just significantly lower. And that includes a few British students, I should say, where now it's lower than the cost in the UK. And it's also enabled us to do work and to gain funding for work that we wouldn't be able to do in the UK in the same way. So in the UK, we're very, very strong in tropical agriculture. If you've been to Nottingham, it's not a very tropical climate. Our big research activity now, we've moved to Malaysia, our tropical agricultural research, and we have students moving in both directions, and we've managed to reduce the cost of research. And establishing new campuses enables you to think about your cost base and reduce costs. So typically in the UK, or at least in my university, we have lots of engineering departments. Every engineering department wants its own dedicated facilities. We couldn't do that in Malaysia. We couldn't afford to do that. So the engineers had to collaborate much more, and we had to build facilities that they could share. That's enabled us to get much better value and much better equipment by collaborating in such a way, and again, reduce costs.
Okay, due to the shortness of your question, I may ask our colleague from the Netherlands, and that will be the final. I do apologize to all of you who have had no chance of asking their question now. You'll have a chance later on.
Yes, hello, Elsa de Werf, Hanse University of Applied Sciences in the Netherlands. God. It's not even, I haven't even had wine yet and I'm already starting to stammer. I have a question about a remark you made about staff development programs that you have in place. And I was wondering if you could briefly outline what those are, and also why you think staff development programs are only necessary for staff going out to your branch campuses, because it seems to me that staff development is also necessary if you want to invite a lot of foreign students to your own campus and to learn how to deal with that.
No, very, very important. I'm sorry if I implied that the staff development was just for staff going overseas. The staff development programme has to be across the board and for all categories of staff, not just academics who might travel overseas, but for all of the staff that support those activities too. So we have staff development programme, or elements of a staff development programme in place, predominantly for academic staff, and I think that's a weakness in our strategy because it needs to be much broader. And I think one of the things that we've learnt from the campuses overseas, and perhaps was behind the question asked by the colleague from York, is that having staff moving in different directions has really helped us to rethink what we do in the UK and for the kinds of academic and non-academic experiences we provide. So it's forcing us to ask questions of ourselves. Is what we do appropriate for all of those students that are coming to us from many countries, but also for the students that come from within the UK, under this banner that's used about Nottingham, this international environment? So let me give you an example, an easy example, and then perhaps a more difficult one. The easy example is business. It was a program that we established in both our campuses in China and Malaysia, relatively easy thing to do, startup costs low. And when we did this, we already had large numbers of international students in the UK. But what we weren't doing for those students is using a wide set of examples and case studies. We adopted that good old-fashioned British approach of sticking to case studies that we know and understand from the UK, maybe North America, or possibly Europe. But the majority of students were coming from Asia. When we opened in China and Malaysia, our academics had to rethink what they were doing because the students were challenging them. And as those academic staff have come back to the UK, or perhaps staff that started in China and or Malaysia have now moved to the UK, the starting point isn't always the UK. They've come with that different kind of experience and are feeding in and building into the syllabus. Now, that's just one thing. I was going to give you a difficult example about physics, because I assume if you teach physics, the laws of physics are the same in the UK, China and Malaysia. But again, I still argue that we need to think about how we support the British students and the international students in the learning of physics in this special environment that we believe we have, or that we believe we're on the road to creating.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Vicenzo. I'm sure we'll have a lot of more questions either during the coffee break or during the panel. Thank you for now. We'll be seeing you later.
Thank you.